Hello and welcome to yesterday's Airlines. It's time for another fleet video, and this time I'm going to be looking at another of my American airline fleets. And if we move across to the American portion of the yesterday's Airlines collection, the airline in today's video is Western Airlines, which, being one of the major US trunk carriers of the regulated area, is housed over here in these two central glass cabinets. And if I walk over towards it, you will gradually see over here on the lower right lots of flying W's and the Western Airlines fleet. Now, Western, obviously, as I said, was one of the major trunk carriers, one of the slightly smaller ones admittedly, but still reasonably solid, and lasted all the way into the 80s when it was swallowed up by Delta. So in this video we're going to look through my Western Airlines fleet in a little bit more detail. So let's get on with that. So I'll start the video as usual at the oldest part of the fleet in terms of service entry. And Western actually hasn't been especially well represented in 400 scale for the period of the 1940s and 50s. It also had a relatively unusual fleet, but there hasn't been a lot. As you can see here, we've got in view a couple of piston prop liners, of which the eldest is almost certainly this DC-4 here in the middle, wearing this interesting scheme with the all silver fuselage. And ahead of that, we've got a couple of younger, I guess, Indian head aircraft dating from the early to mid 50s. We've got a Convair 240 and over here a DC-6. Western obviously in this period was famous for having this chieftain, this Indian head scheme, and it had various different versions of it. The earliest one being here, shown by the Convair with quite a large red sheet line with the Indian subsumed within that. They would modify this scheme regularly until they got their Flying W scheme towards the end of the 60s, I think it was. But this, I think, is the first version of it. Now, before I move across to the rest of the Western aircraft, it's also worth paying attention in the background here. There's a Constellation, not in the colours of Western, but in the colours of Pacific Northern Airlines, an Alaskan carrier, which for a long time was a lot larger than Alaska Airlines. And an airline which was taken over by Western in the 1960s. Annoyingly, there's no turbojet 720 in this scale, so we're missing the Pacific Northern turbojet 720, but there is this lovely Lockheed Constellation by Aero Classics. Okay, I've just opened the other side of the cabinet where you get a better view of most of the fleet. And you can see down here we can now get a much nicer view of that DC-6, which is actually a really nice mould by Aero Classics. And Western in the 50s obviously was beginning to look at what jet equipment it would need, and it settled initially on the Lockheed Electra, and you can see behind it is an Electra in the Electra delivery scheme, which is a modified Chieftain, where the Chieftain now is at the front of this eccentric 4-stripe sheet line, which is part of the headdress now. Obviously, it's not a pure jet, but these turboprops were marketed as jet props to distinguish them from piston airliners. Western's first jet was the Boeing 707, and in the background here you can see a 707. This is meant to be a Series 200, I think, but AC never had the mould. It is nonetheless a turbojet 707, and those are quite rare in 400 scale, so we'll go with it. And it's got the same scheme, or a very similar scheme, as the delivery scheme for the Electras. Now that scheme was simplified on later jets and on the Electras, and to the right here we've got a Boeing 720, which is an airliner which was very important to Western for a long period of time, and you can see that it's got a slightly different version of the scheme. There's now a 3-stripe sheet line to the arrowhead, and the Western is no longer curved in the tail. The red blockhead is a wedge. So there we've got the 720. Moving to the front, we've also got the Electra wearing a same scheme, but you can see the differences with the original. Now behind that, This is where Pacific Northern comes into the story. The takeover of Pacific Northern gave Western some Lockheed constellations, just a couple, very late in their service history. This is well into the 60s. I think it may be 65, 66, I can't remember. But they operated these for a short period of time, and they did get into full Western colours after never having operated a Lockheed constellation previously. But Western's jet fleet really operating in high and hot destinations in the west of the US, as you can see the map behind, places like Denver. Needed 4 jets, and so the 720 and the 707 were important components of the fleet. And here you can see that we've got a 707 320B. Now Western was possibly, it's not a word, possibly, I think, one of the few trunk airlines, if maybe the only trunk airline, that didn't actually ever operate a 727-100. It stuck with its 720s, but it did operate the 727-200, and here is a 727-200 wearing the same scheme. Western, however, was interested in smaller Boeing jets, and it was one of the very early customers for the 737-200 at a time when 737s were not particularly selling well. And once again, here is that livery, but this time worn by the baby Boeing. So this scheme took Western through the majority of the 60s. I actually can't quite remember when they changed. It may have been 69, I can't remember. But the next scheme was a big change in identity. Western had been, for a long time, trading on this fellow, the Wally Bird, and he was used in their adverts, as you can see. He's quite a cool little character. He's kind of like a parrot almost. I'm not sure what kind of bird he's supposed to be. But at this point, they changed over to a new scheme, which you can see here. The big red W, also known as the flying W, also known as the swizzle stick, because it looks a bit like a sort of swizzle stick that you put in a drink. And that scheme came to define Western of the 1970s, and you can see here that we've got a variety of the Western fleet wearing that scheme. First, we've got a 720, which remained an important type in the Western fleet for quite a long number of years, so into the 80s, I think. Behind it, we've got a 727-200, and behind that, a 707-320. And Western really kind of standardised its fleet very much on the 727 and the 737, of which I do have one here in that scheme too. And still kept its 707s around, but obviously, like pretty much all of the majors, felt the need for wide-body equipment, and in doing so acquired a fleet of DC-10s. So here we have a DC-1010. As you can see, they called them spaceships. And Western, in the 70s, began to expand its horizons. It began to acquire long-haul routes, even to places like the UK. And towards the end of the 70s, into the early 80s, they had DC-1030s, like this aircraft, which you can see is called the Londoner. So Western was still one of the smaller trunk airlines in the 70s, but it was reasonably profitable. It was a good, well-run, solid airline, and it began to be coveted by others as deregulation hit and mergers went full tilt. Everyone was merging with somebody, and the smaller trunk airlines were getting swallowed up. Western's day was coming, and I think it was 1986 when Western was taken over by Delta Airlines, who acquired the Salt Lake City hub at the same time. But before that, Western did have time to introduce one last scheme, and that scheme has been known as the Bud Light scheme. It basically is an all-natural metal finished version of the Flying W, and here you can see it on the 777-200, a pair of DC-10s, and also Western's last new aircraft type before it was swallowed up by Delta, the 737-300. And that's why Delta ended up with a small sub-fleet of 737-300s, I think 10 or so, because they acquired them as part of the deal to take over Western. So Western, for much of its history, had been, one of the smaller, less exciting, perhaps, trunk airlines, but it was solidly profitable. It was well run, and unfortunately, that made it something which a lot of the other airlines were interested in. Okay, so that's a quick overview of my Western Airlines fleet. Another, unique and interesting set of liveries amongst the trunk airlines. Really like the Indian head, really like the Flying W scheme. And a shame that they were taken over by Delta, but I guess at least they're taken over by one of the better run majors. So thanks very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. Check out yesterdaysairlines.com, where I've got a full history of Western Airlines liveries. Also, check out the Instagram and Facebook channels at @YesterAirlines. And keep an eye out for more of these fleet videos, because I will be doing more and more as I gradually work my way through my collection of 400 scale model airlines. Thanks very much for watching. See you later.